Okay, right. I'm just going to break into my training for a few minutes and make the DVD for the Fireflies. Whew, blimey! I like to get a good hour in on the mini tramp every evening. Right. So what I'm going to run through is number one, some thoughts on sailing fast in a Firefly. Number two, a bit on boat setup. To be honest, that's only a little bit. This is the major thing. And then some thoughts on going the right way. So I want to talk about how to avoid that, and also how to generate as much height as possible, how to get your Freddy pointing well. Mostly I'm going to talk about how we use the sheets and how we use the rudder. I hope. Those are the bits that I think are most important. But if you're thinking of taking any notes, what I'd suggest is, since I will mention other things that you have on your boat as controls, what I'd suggest is you have some sort of matrix which would be for light, medium and overpowered conditions. What we'll do is refer to the different elements of controls that you've got, things that you can do that will help you to control your boat and go faster. Right, I've got my scale model of a Freddy here, and so the main principles for all conditions to bear in mind. First of all, I said stall is the enemy. Okay, so stall. What could cause a stall? Certainly, if we sheet in too hard, we can get the boat into a stalled situation. And in particular, if we close the slot off too much, then we can generate a stalled situation. It's also possible to get into a situation where you stall the foils out, and in particular if you overuse your rudder, you're generating turbulence and stalling that out. So all of those are bad news things, but having said that, if you start over easing the sails, clearly you're going to lose height. So I'm certainly using a lot of main sheet tension generally, and my medium wind setup, which is what I'll start by talking through, is using a lot of main sheet tension to the extent that I'm pulling pretty much as hard as I can and not using any kicker tension. So the kicker's going slack. When I pull the main in hard, the kicker's going slack. Sally is also able to sheet the jib pretty tight. So to achieve that without stalling, we've got some things which I'll discuss in boat setup to do with the mast, but nothing too radical. But basically, medium conditions, we're sheeting really very hard, and I see some people sailing with the sheets far too lightly loaded. In terms of the sensitivity to the slot that I talked about, it's really important that the crew's alert to easing the jib slightly to open the slot if there's any need to do that, either for some waves or just to get some speed on, and certainly after attack. It's important to be sensitive to keeping that slot breathing and air flowing through it. As far as why we point well, I honestly believe it's just simply because we get the sails a bit flatter than most people, and we're sheeting them harder. And in addition to that, we're keeping the boat more level. It's very, very textbook. A lot of people write it and say it, but not many people do it on the water. So we're simply sailing the boat more level more of the time. In terms of other basic controls, in medium wind, I'm using the centre board in a kind of normal position. And when I talk through light winds and heavy winds, we do adjust the position of the centre board. But when I say normal position, I mean the hole in the centre board is about level with the top of the centre board case. I'm going to talk a little bit later on about how we respond to waves, because all the setup and ways that we're sailing fast in flat water changes quite dramatically when we get some significant waves. Okay, in medium winds, one of the biggest risks in terms of going slowly is that you allow yourself to generate a sailing position that encourages you to put some leeward heel on the boat, and weather helm starts to be generated in the boat. You see this a lot if you're looking directly into the transom of a boat. you can see that their tiller's off the centre line for the majority of the time. It may be moving in waves a bit, but if it's off the centre line a lot of the time, that's slow. And that's simply a function of the fact they haven't got the boat level. If they just feathered the boat slightly and let it get level, they can centre their tiller. The flow over the foils is more comfortable, and the hull shape's more comfortable moving through the water. Everything is more positive, and you will go a lot quicker. Okay, in terms of trying to help you get to that flat tiller in the middle sailing position, just a couple of thoughts on tips really. Firstly, a really useful exercise is just to develop the confidence as a team, as a helm and crew team, by just try sailing along with windward heel, and actually just show each other that you can be comfortable in the conditions you're sailing in, sailing with windward heel, and that's okay. That will give you the confidence that you won't be sitting in, or in particular one of you, maybe the crew, is sitting in when the boat comes level, having been leeward heeled. Because what I see in a lot of boats is the boats are leeward heeled, it comes level, the crew sits in, and then it remains slightly heeled. The other tip I'd give is crews in particular, look aft and sight the transom across the horizon or into the water and see whether it's level or not. If it's not, if you can see you're leaning to leeward, shift your weight to windward if you possibly can. Okay, so I'm now going to try and answer the question, what are the biggest things that we change in the boat when it becomes, we go into light air mode. So firstly, we're sailing with less sheet tension at that time. So the slot is slightly more forgiving, the jibs ease slightly, the mains ease slightly, and we certainly start to see the top of the leech of the mainsail opening a little bit more. I'm looking for the top of the mainsail to be flicking. I'm actually looking for that in medium winds as well, but to achieve the flicking leech in light winds, you need to have some sensitivity on the main sheet. In very light winds, I'd certainly be turning the ratchet off on the main sheet. And in terms of other controls, if there are waves, I might well try to stabilise the rig with just a little bit more jib halyard than I have in a medium wind, just to give the jib some stability, which in medium winds is provided by the strong main sheet tension that you have on the boat. In lighter winds, sometimes I find the luff, if it's wobbling around too much, that can destabilise the whole rig. It tends to be more in wavy conditions. It's not really a problem in flat water. I mentioned before that we do change the position of the centre plate, and in light winds I would drop it down so the top of the centre plate has gone into the centre plate case, so we don't have one of the rubber washers and things on the top. The actual opportunity in light winds and flat water is an opportunity to actually generate a little bit of windward heel as you're sailing along upwind, and I'm actually trying to get into a mode where I have a slight amount of a leeward tiller and a slight amount of windward heel. If you can do that in flat water, I think it's extremely quick. I believe it works quite well with top level laser sailors as well. So that's a possible aim, to get into a mode where you've got a slight windward heel. Once it gets really light, you can't afford to have the windward heel. You certainly need a slight amount of leeward heel just to keep the sail sweet. As far as fore and aft trim is concerned, in lighter winds I'm shifting my weight so that I'm in front of the thwart. So I've crossed certainly one leg in front of the thwart, if not in very light winds both legs in front of the thwart, as I think most helms are doing. So I'm shifting a good 2 feet further forward. Okay, now I'm going to try and answer the question, how do I change from a medium wind setting of sailing the boat to an overpowered situation? What do I mean by overpowered? Well, basically, despite hiking really hard, we're finding that I'm beginning to have to ease the main sheet and potentially both sails. Well, at this point, my golden rule of really not using any kicker starts to become under threat, because if you have to ease the mainsail and you've got very little kicker on, in other words, kicker that when you sheet tight, the kicker starts to go slack, As if you then get into overpowered conditions, your boom is skying up quite a bit. So I do start to use some kicker in overpowered conditions, but I still avoid using very much for as long as possible, because the kicker, I find, distorts the whole rig to such an extent that it destroys the sail pattern. And so I don't want to do that until the strongest breeze. The other big thing I change in stronger wind is I start to ease the rig tension off. So I've got that lead to a position on the mini thwart just in front of me, so that as the breeze picks up, I'm able to drop the rig back, and that means that the slot is more open because the mainsail moves backwards away from the jib. As an indication, in very strong winds, my boom can get to a point where it's touching the transom. Bearing in mind I'm still sailing with a short mast, so I guess in a plastic boat that's about 4 inches above the transom. So that's a very eased jib halyard, and that also allows the mast to bend more because the shrouds have gone looser, so you get more fore and aft bend and more sideways bend. So you're spilling wind in all the possible different ways you can spill wind, in the hope that you can still keep the boat as level as possible and sail forward. The centre plate, in order to accommodate the fact that the rig swung aft, I swing the centre plate aft as well. So what I mean by that is I lift it so the hole is 2 or 3 inches, or Sally lifts it so that the hole is 2 or 3 inches above the top of the centre plate case, and then I can have more chance of keeping my tiller neutral, and we definitely track quicker. You can still sail it with the centre plate right down. The boat tends to trip up more in gusts, and you end up using a lot more weather helm, which is significantly slower. So it is worth adjusting your centre plate for strong winds when you're overpowered. Okay, so next I'd like to try and address what we do to change the boat and the way we're sailing the boat when we are approaching a set of waves, or if we're sailing in generally wavy conditions. Bear in mind my normal trimming position as a helm, so that my fore and aft position in the boat will be just behind the thwart, and Sally would just be a comfortable distance in front of me, so not far from the shroud, I guess. So that's relatively far forward in order to keep the trim as correct as we can. If we're going to hit waves, that trim is too far forward in the boat, and the bow will dig hard into a wave crest if we remained with our body positions in that sort of area. So just before a wave hits, we do 2 things. We move aft to try and lift the bow, and we move in to generate some leeward heel. And the reason we move in to generate leeward heel is so that the bow, with a bit of assistance with some rudder to leeward, can nicely move up over a wave crest. Okay, so those 3 synchronized actions, moving aft to leeward, and putting the tiller to leeward, will allow the bow to gracefully go over a wave rather than dig into it. And then as you go over the crest, you can level, move forward, and centralize. Okay, and that you then get into a situation where you're repeating those movements. And I think the best analogy I can come up with is to steal Steve Cockerell's analogy, which is kind of like when you're jumping over moguls on a ski slope, and you want to kind of pre-jump the moguls to keep connected with the snow. If you start taking a lot of air time, you'll actually lose speed compared to a skier who pre-jumps and remains in contact with the snow as much as possible. And that's exactly true of the bow of your boat. If you allow the bow to sky up or dig in, you will slow down. So you're trying to pre-jump each wave as you come to it. And putting that leeward heel on, which is counterintuitive from the advice I gave before, because obviously upright is fast in terms